Have you ever wondered how a tiny secret, known only to one person, can sometimes change a life forever? A loyal servant, an innocent gesture, and a fear. This is the story of a secret so powerful it leaves an indelible mark on the soul. But when that secret is revealed, does one have the courage to face the truth? In this tale, every step will lead you to a terrifying reality you may never want to understand. A truth that could change everything, or send you spiraling into fear. The sky above St. Mary's was a soft blue, dotted with only a few lazy clouds as Miss Marple's cab meandered up the winding gravel path towards Summerley House. The old manor sat atop a gentle incline, its once grand facade now weathered and weary, the stone walls adorned with creeping ivy. Time had not been kind to it. The windows, though scrubbed clean, held a certain heaviness, as though the years had left their imprint, and the brass door knocker, though polished, seemed to carry the weight of forgotten histories. Miss Marple, ever observant, took note of the slightly overgrown garden beds, and the subtle signs of neglect that even the most untrained eye might miss, yet she saw in them a house that had once bustled with life, now sagging under the weight of its own past. The door creaked open under the hands of Mrs. Dracott, the housekeeper, whose stiff smile betrayed an air of forced politeness. Miss Marple accepted the greeting with quiet grace, though her sharp eyes missed no detail. The way Mrs. Dracott stood a little too straight, the fleeting, nervous glance she cast toward the parlor door, and the faint perfume of lavender that clung to the air, trying but failing to cover a deeper, more unpleasant scent. As Miss Marple entered, she immediately felt it, a heaviness, a stillness in the air, the kind of silence that speaks volumes, the kind that lingers in homes where long-buried secrets tremble, just waiting for the wrong question to bring them into the light. The parlor itself was a cozy, outdated affair, the mismatched furniture worn from years of use, each piece whispering stories of old wealth now dwindled into quiet penury. Lady Frobisher, seated at the center of the room, wore her eccentricities like a badge of honor, bright scarves, excessive rings, and a laugh that felt out of place, a little too loud for the moment. Beside her, her niece Alice sat rigidly on the edge of her chair, her tone sharp enough to slice through the pleasantries that hung in the air. There was a hardness to Alice, a bitterness that seemed out of place for someone so young, as though life had already convinced her that it owed her nothing. Mrs. Dracott, ever the dutiful servant, hovered nearby, offering tea with a practiced, almost mechanical precision, as though every gesture carried the weight of a secret she'd long ago learned to keep buried. Notably absent was Julian Frobisher, the estranged son, whose name was often muttered in hushed tones, a subject swiftly avoided, as though the mention of him might awaken a long-dead memory. Miss Marple, ever the observer, said little, letting the conversation unfold around her, her knitting needles clicking softly in her lap. Every smile, every awkward silence, every strained word spoke volumes. She did not need to hear the truth to know it, it was in what was not said, the carefully constructed facades that each of them wore. It was a house held together by fragile threads, habits, secrets, and unspoken truths, that no one dared to unravel. It was Lady Frobisher, who finally mentioned the parlor cabinet, her voice soft, as though introducing an old friend. Made of oak and mahogany, the cabinet stood in the corner, a wedding gift from her first marriage. A flicker of tension passed through the room, but it was quick, a shadow too faint for the untrained eye to notice. Alice's lips tightened, and Mrs. Dracott, though silent, seemed to grow visibly stiffer. The first husband, Julian's father, had given her the cabinet, a man who had died under mysterious circumstances, his death a cloud of rumors and suspicion. There were whispers of a maid, Edith, her name had been, who vanished one evening, and was never seen again. The village had its stories, but homes like this were experts at forgetting the inconvenient truths. Miss Marple, still knitting, made no comment, though her sharp gaze drifted to the cabinet, where the polished wood gleamed faintly under the dim light. A subtle gap at one corner caught her attention, as though something had once been forced inside. Alice, with an air of nonchalance, moved toward the cabinet, running her fingers along its carved edges. "Ugly thing," she remarked, though the words lacked conviction, her tone betraying a deeper unease. Her fingers brushed the lower panel, and with a faint click, a hidden compartment slid open. Inside, an old envelope, its edges yellowed with age, lay innocently, yet there was nothing innocent about it. For a long moment, no one spoke. The envelope rested there, a silent witness to a forgotten past, one that had been waiting for someone to unearth it. Mrs. Dracott's hands trembled ever so slightly, her composure slipping, and Lady Frobisher's smile faltered, a crack in her carefully cultivated facade. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the envelope, her mind already racing, piecing together the whispers and secrets that had been left behind. The truth, she knew, was hidden within that yellowed paper, and it was only a matter of time before the past came tumbling into the light. As the evening deepened, Summerley House seemed to exhale, as if the very walls of the mansion were holding their breath, preparing for the storm that had silently gathered in the shadows. The air, thick with the remnants of the day, felt oppressive, as though it knew something none of them were willing to acknowledge yet. Miss Marple sat in the corner of the guest room, her knitting abandoned in her lap, her fingers unmoving. The room itself seemed to pulse with an unspoken tension, the kind that presses against the ribs, making it difficult to breathe. She observed it all, the way every person in the house had begun to act just slightly out of character, as though they were all part of a delicate dance they could no longer control. It was in the way Alice held herself, tense and rigid near the fireplace, the way Mrs. Dracott's fingers seemed to twitch involuntarily, as she adjusted her shawl. Even Lady Frobisher, who usually radiated composure, had a nervous edge to her polite smile. The envelope, that innocuous piece of paper that had passed so silently from hand to hand earlier in the day, now seemed to weigh on the house like a curse, an anchor that none could escape. It was a secret, a story left unfinished but now ready to unfold, whether they were ready for it or not. Miss Marple could feel it, the heavy throb of impending revelation. The silence in the house was unnatural, too thick, and too quiet, stretching itself too thin. No one spoke of the envelope, but its presence loomed, making the slightest sound, footsteps, a cough, a rustling sleeve, seem amplified, as though the house itself was listening. Each person seemed caught in their own world, eyes darting toward the cabinet in the parlor, toward the place where the envelope had been concealed for years, untouched. But now it had disappeared, like a ghost slipping through the cracks of a forgotten memory. Miss Marple knew, with a certainty that only years of experience could offer, that the disappearance of that envelope was no coincidence. It was a deliberate act, an invitation to chaos, and now the question was not whether it would be found but when, and who would be caught in its wake. The stillness was shattered by the sudden sharp cry that echoed through the hallways, a sound too quick, too abrupt to be anything but a warning. It was followed by the unmistakable thud of something or someone striking the ground. Miss Marple rose even before the second sound came, the sound of a body collapsing in a heap, a sound she knew too well. Her heart quickened, but her steps remained measured, each one taking her closer to the heart of the mystery that was unfurling. By the time she reached the landing, the household was already in motion, a flurry of activity that was as much about appearance as it was about urgency. The air was thick with the smell of fear. No one wanted to acknowledge it, but it hung like a cloud over the group, weighing down their every movement. Lady Frobisher, pale and trembling, had been found collapsed on the stairs, her silk robe now a flimsy shield against the cold reality of what was unfolding. Her breathing was shallow, erratic, her eyes barely open, confusion clouding her once steady gaze. Her hand reached out weakly, grasping at nothing as though trying to hold on to something that had already slipped through her fingers. Mrs. Dracott was the first to kneel beside her, but her face was drawn, too pale, the usual calm of her demeanor gone, replaced by an uncertainty that made her touch hesitant. Alice appeared moments later, her sharp voice cutting through the air, demanding answers that no one had. Colonel Whitaker stood to the side, his posture rigid, his gaze fixed not on Lady Frobisher but on the parlor door, left ajar, the faintest creak of it swinging ever so slightly in the draught. It was as if someone was waiting to make their move. Miss Marple, with the practiced calm of someone who had seen far too much of the world's secrets unfold, said nothing. She simply observed, her eyes flicking from one person to the next, her mind already turning, piecing together the fragments of the scene. Her fingers, however, hovered briefly over her knitting, then she set it down with deliberate care. She knew the silence would tell her more than any words ever could. The others were busy with their frantic gestures, administering smelling salts, whispering frantic questions. But Miss Marple's thoughts were elsewhere, already tracing the event that had led up to this moment. Her first stop was the parlor. The cabinet, which had been so innocently present earlier in the day, stood as it always had, its polished wood gleaming dully in the lamplight. But the compartment that had been opened earlier, first by Alice's curiosity and later, Miss Marple suspected, by someone else's more deliberate actions, was now empty. The envelope was gone. The dust where it had once rested was disturbed. Twice now, once by innocent hands, and once by something far more calculating. Her fingers trailed lightly over the wood, pausing at the spot where the hidden compartment had clicked open. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign that anyone had been in a hurry, but the feeling that someone had been there watching, waiting, lingered like a shadow. She glanced toward the window, noting the uneven draw of the curtain. A narrow gap in the fabric caught the light, enough to allow someone to peer inside, to watch the cabinet from the outside. Or perhaps, Miss Marple mused, from within. Returning to the hallway, she noted the quiet chaos unfolding. Lady Frobisher was being carried to her room, her pallor and fainted state drawing concern. But it was the silence of the room that spoke the loudest. Everyone had gathered in the drawing room, yet no one quite knew why. It was as if the room itself was waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. Tea was served, untouched, except by Miss Marple, who sipped it calmly, as though the world were not collapsing around her. Alice stood rigid by the mantel, her arms crossed so tightly that her knuckles were white with strain. Mrs. Dracut stood apart, her gaze fixed on the floor, her fingers nervously twirling the edge of her apron. The weight of their collective uncertainty hung in the air, each one aware that something monumental was about to occur, but no one dared to be the one to speak first. The envelope, its contents now a secret known only to a select few, had turned the house into a pressure cooker, its quiet hum threatening to explode at the slightest provocation. As the minutes stretched on, Miss Marple allowed herself a small knowing smile. She had seen this before. She knew the scent of secrets, the way they shifted in the air like dust, swirling, waiting to settle. But in this house, those secrets had teeth, and soon they would bite. The question was no longer whether the truth would come out, but when, and who would be the first to be consumed by it. The dim glow of the morning light barely cut through the heavy curtains, casting elongated shadows on the polished wooden floors of Summerley House. The air was thick with the unspoken words that had settled like dust over the rooms, invisible but undeniable. It was a morning like no other, the kind that carries the weight of things left unsaid, and secrets too dark to be whispered aloud. Breakfast had been served, but the room was too quiet, the clinking of silverware too sharp, the polite exchanges too hollow. Julian, who had appeared unexpectedly after years abroad, sat by the window, his posture too relaxed to be genuine, his eyes scanning the room as though he were searching for something he couldn't quite place. Mrs. Dracut's hands trembled slightly as she poured tea, her grip tight around the pot as though it might slip from her grasp at any moment. Colonel Whitaker, once the embodiment of jolly good cheer, now seemed like a man on edge, his usual joviality replaced by a careful stillness that belied the tension in the air. His eyes flicked from one person to the next, pausing only when they settled on the parlor door. It was as if the room itself were a puzzle to be solved, and each person had a piece of the answer, but not the courage to put it together. Miss Marple, ever the observer, watched silently from her seat, her knitting needles clicking softly in the quiet of the room. Her hands were still, but her mind was in motion, turning over the evening's events, the missing envelope, the secrets they all carried so carefully in their hearts. She had seen the flicker of guilt in Alice's eyes, the sharp, too casual edge to Julian's demeanor, and the way Mrs. Dracut's lips trembled whenever Lady Frobisher's name was mentioned. She knew that fear had a way of wearing people down, of showing through the cracks in their carefully constructed facades. The room held its breath, each person aware that something was about to happen, though none of them dared to speak it aloud. And then, as if the silence itself had become unbearable, Alice's voice sliced through the tension, brittle and sharp, her words like broken glass. "This will cost us," she said, her eyes flicking nervously toward the empty seat at the head of the table. Lady Frobisher, who had always been a fixture in that chair, was conspicuously absent. The room seemed to shrink in on itself as Alice's words hung in the air, each syllable heavy with something more than just concern. Mrs. Dracot's disapproving hum was lost in the weight of Alice's unspoken resentment, the bitterness that had long simmered beneath the surface now bubbling to the top. It wasn't just money that Alice resented, it was the years of being overlooked, of having to watch Lady Frobisher's wealth and influence, never quite able to claim her share. And now, with the unexpected fall of their benefactor, the cracks began to show, each one revealing something darker beneath. Julian, for all his sudden reappearance, remained eerily silent, his eyes darting around the room, never lingering too long on any one face. His silence spoke volumes, louder than any of the words that filled the room. Everyone knew that people didn't return home after years abroad without a reason, and that reason, Miss Marple suspected, was far from innocent. Colonel Whitaker, his voice a low murmur, spoke only once, offering an offhand remark about how quickly accidents could happen on steep staircases. Yet, as he spoke, his gaze never left the cabinet in the parlor, and Miss Marple, ever the observer, found herself counting the number of times his eyes flickered toward it. It was as though he too were waiting for something or someone to make their move. As the morning dragged on, the usual pretenses wore thin, the polite exchanges grew more forced, the silence between words more telling than the words themselves. The missing envelope, the one that had caused so much unrest the night before, was the elephant in the room. Everyone knew it was gone, and yet no one spoke of it directly. It was a secret that had taken on a life of its own, swirling around the house, twisting itself into the fabric of the household's very existence. Miss Marple felt it in the way the room shifted, in the nervous glances and the way the air seemed to crackle with anticipation. Secrets were a currency in a house like this, and everyone was spending theirs with careful calculation. Alice, her voice still sharp with the remnants of her earlier bitterness, continued to speak, her words tumbling out in an almost rehearsed manner. Her debts, small at first, but growing, she offered them with careless abandon, each complaint a sharp note in a symphony of resentment. She spoke of Lady Frobisher's refusal to lend a hand, her tight grip on her own fortune, and the unspoken bitterness that had festered for years. It was all too perfect, too orchestrated, Miss Marple thought, as though Alice had been waiting for this moment to strike. But the true story, she suspected, was still hidden in the spaces between Alice's words, in the way her cheeks flushed and her hands clenched around her teacup. The guilt was there, thick and heavy, but Miss Marple knew better than to take things at face value. The house, like its inhabitants, had a secret, and it was waiting to be revealed. But first, Miss Marple would have to follow the clues, trace the threads that had unraveled so carelessly, until she reached the heart of the mystery. And in the end, she would uncover what they had all tried so desperately to keep hidden. Lady Frobisher had made her stance clear many months ago: no more handouts, no more soft words. Alice was to fend for herself, to stand on her own feet, and it was a command that had etched itself into the very fabric of the household. Yet, beneath the surface, the tension was palpable. It was the kind of weight that did not immediately translate into violence, but simmered beneath the calm, threatening to burst out when least expected. As Miss Marple sat quietly, she couldn't ignore the subtle shifts, the way a foot would tap restlessly, a glance linger a moment too long, or a breath catch in the wrong place. It wasn't enough for murder, no, at least not by the obvious measure. But it was enough to create desperation, and desperation, Miss Marple knew all too well, could turn even the most innocent of actions into something deadly. It was during this fragile quiet that the conversation took an unexpected turn. Julian entered the room as though summoned by some invisible force, his return more of a disturbance than a reunion. His figure stood for a moment too long in the doorway, uncertain and awkward, his posture stiff as though caught between two worlds. "You're back," Alice's voice, flat and sharp, broke the silence. It was an understatement, a tone of surprise that neither of them fully embraced. Julian, his eyes flickering toward Mrs. Dracott, responded in a manner that seemed almost practiced, as if the words had been carefully considered before being spoken. Just for a little while. The words were soft, but there was a distance in them that made Miss Marple raise an eyebrow. His eyes, though, never seemed to land on anything for too long, shifting constantly, restless. His fingers tapped once, twice, against the wooden table, a subtle but telling sign of discomfort. It was the kind of gesture that betrayed more than he realized. As his gaze moved fleetingly toward the cabinet, the same cabinet that had caught the attention of so many, yet revealed nothing, Miss Marple's mind sharpened. There was something about his return that had less to do with nostalgia or familial bonds and far more to do with the missing envelope, the one that had started this chain of events. His return was no accident. People did not leave for years, disappear without a trace, and then reappear without some form of urgent purpose. Miss Marple's suspicion lingered, growing. She observed how Julian adjusted himself uncomfortably in the chair, as though trying to find a place in a room that no longer quite fit him. He had been gone too long, he was no longer certain of his place, of the rules that governed this house. But the changes in him were not just those of time, they were also the marks of someone who had come back for a reason, far darker than merely checking on his mother. Mrs. Dracott, meanwhile, had positioned herself near the cabinet again, her every action seeming to center around it. She was careful, always moving in a way that suggested she was attempting to keep something hidden, something precious, something dangerous. Miss Marple knew that kind of loyalty all too well, the kind that binds a person to a secret, even one that was not their own. It was a loyalty that knew too much and yet said nothing. When Miss Marple inquired about the cabinet's origins, Mrs. Dracott's response was quick and sharp. "Nothing special, ma'am, just an old thing." The words were careless, too quick, too dismissive. It was a lie that didn't even attempt to sound convincing, a lie Miss Marple had heard too many times before. The way Mrs. Dracott's fingers lingered on the surface of the cabinet, smoothing it almost reverently, told a far different story. She was guarding something, though whether she was guarding it out of loyalty or fear, Miss Marple couldn't yet tell. One thing was clear, Mrs. Dracott knew more than she let on. The conversation shifted, and after breakfast, Miss Marple wandered to the back of the house, near where the servants gathered, where whispers flowed like water. Her young maid, cheeks still flushed from the early attention, had overheard something, a quarrel in the dead of night. The voices had been muffled, but the emotions behind them had not been. Anger, fear, old grievances surfacing once more. The maid could not say whether it had been Julian or Colonel Whitaker involved, but Miss Marple was certain it had been one of them. The conflict was not important, it was the fear that interested her, the way it had hung in the air, thick and suffocating, like a warning that someone had far more at stake than merely their position in the household. It was Colonel Whitaker, however, who would offer her the next clue. As Miss Marple passed the drawing room, she overheard him muttering something under his breath, words half to himself, "Some secrets are better left buried." He turned sharply as he caught sight of her in the doorway, his smile thin and forced. He said no more, but Miss Marple did not need him to. The truth was already laid bare before her. Secrets, no matter how deep or well hidden, never stayed buried forever, they only waited for the right hands to unearth them. And Miss Marple knew with a quiet certainty that the right moment was rapidly approaching. Time was slipping away, and everyone was about to be exposed. The bell above the shop door jingled with an uncharacteristic cheer, breaking Miss Marple's reverie. She stepped inside, her presence as gentle as ever, her hands neatly clasped around her handbag. Her eyes moved over the shelves, filled with items that once held meaning but were now forgotten relics, gathering dust. Mr. Cattle emerged from the back room, offering a smile that was polite but distant. The shop was quiet, far too quiet for comfort, and Miss Marple could sense the unease in the air. Trade had been slow, he explained with a distracted shrug. The shop was no longer a place for lively conversation or meaningful exchanges. Miss Marple, however, remained undeterred. Her mind was sharp, and her eyes, though seemingly disinterested, were taking in every detail. There was something about this place, about this very shop, that felt like an artifact, a place where secrets were not only kept but traded. The past was never truly gone, not when people like Mr. Cattle continued to collect and hold on to it. Miss Marple had a distinct feeling that this shop, like the rest of the house, was soon going to reveal its hidden truths, truths that had been waiting far too long to be unearthed. And when they came to light, they would change everything. Miss Marple, ever the keen observer, had long since learned the art of fitting pieces into an intricate puzzle, often with little more than a whispered clue or an offhand comment. Her attention to the parlor cabinet was no different. As tourists scuttled about with little appreciation for the rich history that lay beneath their feet, Miss Marple's gaze lingered with a quiet intensity that drew the attention of Mr. Cattle, who initially remained on edge. His tense composure softened the moment she approached the cabinet, her curiosity framed with such delicate innocence that it almost seemed to disarm him. "Ah yes, peace," he murmured, brushing a line of dust from an ormolu clock, his fingers tracing the craftsmanship of something that was quickly becoming rare in the world of mass-produced trinkets. "They don't make them like this anymore," Miss Marple agreed, her voice soft but steady, as though inviting more than just polite conversation. "When did this cabinet arrive at Sumley?" she asked, her words gently punctuating the silence. "And was it always considered a treasure?" The question was simple, the tone disarming, but the undercurrent of inquiry was unmistakable. Mr. Cattle, a man who reveled in the thrill of sharing stories, responded eagerly, his voice lowering as though to heighten the effect. "The cabinet arrived nearly 30 years ago," he began, his eyes briefly flickering with something darker. "It was purchased shortly after the sudden death of Lady Frobisher's first husband. Now that my dear lady was a curious thing. Lady Frobisher herself walked into the shop, asked for something very specific, something she knew exactly what she wanted, didn't haggle, not at all. That was unlike her, you see." He paused, the shadows of old gossip clouding his eyes. The cabinet was unremarkable to most, but she handled it as if she knew it, fingers tracing its edges, as though she were reacquainting herself with an old friend. No explanation. She had it sent to Sumley the very next day, and no one thought to ask questions. The words settled between them like an unspoken secret. Miss Marple's smile remained in place, but her mind was already racing, her thoughts aligning the pieces of a story that hadn't yet revealed its full shape. Furniture, after all, often came with more than just wood and varnish. It carried with it stories, sometimes troubling, sometimes dangerous, a quiet history that only the most astute could recognize. Miss Marple turned the question over in her mind. Why had Lady Frobisher sought out that particular piece of furniture so soon after her husband's untimely demise? And why had it been sent to Sumley in such haste? It all seemed too neat, too calculated. But it was the history before Sumley that intrigued her the most, the part that Mr. Cattle leaned in to share in a voice filled with just the right amount of mystery. "Before it came to Sumley," he began, glancing around the shop, as though to ensure no one else could overhear, "it belonged to a family with its own troubles, well respected at first, but then the whispers began. A maid, Edith, clever but too pretty for her own good, vanished one night without a trace. No coat, no wages, just gone." Mr. Cattle's voice dropped even lower, his tone laced with that familiar sense of relish that only a good salacious story could provide. Rumor had it she was involved with someone she shouldn't have been, a secret romance of sorts, but no one ever found a body, no evidence, just the disappearance, and the cabinet. That was the only thing left behind. He paused, shaking his head as if he were reliving the town's gossip. The family left the village soon after, sold off their belongings, this cabinet included, and with it they left behind a whisper that still clung to it like dust. Mr. Cattle's expression was a mix of disbelief and disdain. "Bad luck. That piece. Should have burned it if you ask me." Miss Marple's smile flickered briefly, a small knowing curve of her lips. "Furniture doesn't whisper," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper itself, "but houses remember. And so do the people who stay behind." She understood, of course. The significance of objects wasn't always found in their surface value, but in the lingering energy they absorbed over time, energy that could linger long after the last person had left. It was the way these things had a tendency to hang on, like unwanted guests who simply refused to leave. Despite its craftsmanship, the cabinet had sold cheaply. Too cheaply, as Mr. Cattle admitted. People didn't want it, he said, shrugging as though that explained everything. A piece like that with a story like that, it doesn't sit easy. Miss Marple nodded in quiet agreement, her mind already turning the fragments of past and present over in the silence that followed. Stories like these were always more than they seemed, always tied to something darker, something hidden beneath the surface. It was clear to her now that Lady Frobisher, in her search for a bargain, had welcomed far more than just the cabinet into her home. She had invited the weight of its history, a history that could no longer be ignored. There are bargains, Miss Marple thought, that always come with a price. As she walked back to Sumley, her pace slowed, her mind whirring with the implications of what she had learned. Lady Frobisher, it seemed, had made a choice, one that would come with consequences. The cabinet, for all its fine craftsmanship, was no ordinary piece of furniture. It had traveled with a story, and stories, as Miss Marple knew all too well, had a way of catching up with those who least expected them. The price of this particular bargain, Miss Marple was certain, was about to reveal itself in ways no one could have predicted. Miss Marple moved through the old house with the grace of someone who had spent a lifetime studying the subtle shifts of human behavior, her every step purposeful and unhurried. The air in Summerley had a peculiar weight to it, as though it had absorbed all the unspoken secrets and fears of the people within its walls, and now, it seemed, it was preparing to exhale. The house had not changed much over the years, but to her sharp eyes, it was filled with the echoes of long-forgotten stories and untold truths. There was something in the silence, a creeping unease that made her senses sharper, her mind working faster. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew that nothing, not even time, could conceal the truth for long. It was the cabinet, though, that caught her attention, the one that had stood in the corner collecting dust and time. For years it had been an innocent piece of furniture, holding its stories tightly within. But as Miss Marple's eyes lingered on it, she knew better. There were secrets there, secrets that had been hidden away, waiting for the right moment to be unearthed. The weight of those secrets was palpable, as if the cabinet itself had been holding its breath, waiting to be discovered. Her mind, always so precise and deliberate, turned over the details she had already collected, forming connections that only she could see. She could feel the tension in the air, a quiet, almost invisible current that hinted at something more than just a simple death. Lady Frobisher's sudden demise had shaken the household, but Miss Marple knew better than to trust the surface calm. People, particularly those who had lived long enough to become accustomed to their own little deceptions, wore grief like an ill-fitting coat, its seams too tight, its sleeves too long. It wasn't genuine sorrow that filled the room, but the subtle tension of a well-rehearsed act. No one seemed to mourn as they should. Mrs. Dracott, for example, wore the look of someone who had long ago learned how to handle loss, but her expression lacked the rawness, the true pain, of someone who had just lost a loved one. Alice, on the other hand, seemed restless, her eyes darting toward the hall every time the floor creaked underfoot, her behavior more nervous than mournful. Colonel Whitaker, always a picture of military composure, stood stiffly, his face a mask of practiced grief, while Julian, the grieving son, seemed to have slipped effortlessly into the role of mourner, his silence too convenient, too smooth. Miss Marple's eyes moved over the gathered faces, studying them with the careful scrutiny of someone who had seen too many such performances in her time. There was no real sorrow here, only a carefully constructed facade. It wasn't the manner of mourning that intrigued Miss Marple, though it was the way the household seemed to be carrying on as if nothing was out of place, as if Lady Frobisher's death was simply another passing event. But something was off, and Miss Marple knew that beneath the surface, a different story was unfolding. She had seen this sort of thing before. Grief was often sincere, but at Summerley, it felt like a performance hastily thrown together, as though the mourners had been handed their lines but forgot to feel the weight of the words they were meant to speak. Later, when the others had withdrawn, Miss Marple took her quiet turn through Lady Frobisher's room, offering assistance with the morning arrangements as a cover for her own observations. The room was a portrait of disarray. A glass of water, half full, its surface streaked with fingerprints, lay beside an empty pill vial, carelessly left on its side. These were not the details of someone preparing for bed with calm and measured care. They were the marks of hurried hands, of someone trying to cover their tracks, but failing to do so. To an ordinary observer, these things might seem insignificant, the usual clutter of daily life. But to Miss Marple, they stood out like a bold mark on a blank page, each small inconsistency adding weight to her suspicions. She knelt beside the bedside table, her eyes scanning the scene with the practiced precision of a detective who could see far beyond the surface. The pill vial, once full of heart medication, was now empty, its contents consumed in a hurry. This wasn't the peaceful passing of someone who had slipped away in their sleep. No, this was something far more deliberate, far more calculated. It was a death that had been touched not by sorrow, but by something darker, something that smelled faintly of fear and desperation. Miss Marple stood, folding her hands as she stepped back into the hallway, her mind already piecing together the puzzle she was beginning to see. It wasn't just what had been taken, but what had been left behind that held the key. She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew the truth was there, waiting to be uncovered. She had learned long ago that secrets had a way of slipping through the cracks, no matter how tightly they were held. As she made her way down the hall, she overheard the hushed voices of the servants gathered together like birds on a wire, heads bent in quiet conversation. Miss Marple's ears were always attuned to the whispers of the house, the way people who were rarely noticed could reveal the most telling details. It was from them that she learned the next crucial piece of the puzzle. Alice had been heard in a heated argument with Lady Frobisher the night before her death. Sharp words had been exchanged, something about money, or rather the refusal of it. The maid, eager to share her story, had a little too much fervor in her voice, as though she had already decided what the truth was. Miss Marple listened carefully, nodding gently as she absorbed not only the words, but the tone in which they were spoken. The eagerness of the servant's account was telling. It revealed a bias, a skewed perspective, the kind of distortion that gossip often created. It was clear that Alice was hiding something, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover what it was. With each new detail, she felt the pieces of the puzzle coming together, fitting snugly into place. There was a mystery here, one that had been carefully crafted and concealed behind a facade of politeness proper mourning. But Miss Marple knew that the truth was never as simple as it seemed, and she would stop at nothing to uncover the dark story that lay just beneath the surface. As she left Summerley that afternoon, a deep sense of certainty settled over her. This story, the one tangled in the lives of its residents and the secrets they were so desperate to keep hidden, was far from finished. Miss Marple knew that she had only begun to uncover its depths, and whatever had been carefully buried in the past would soon rise to the surface. The truth, as always, was waiting to be found, and it would be Miss Marple who would uncover it. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Alice, the tension in the air growing thick with the weight of unspoken truths. The young woman's voice had risen sharply, her hands trembling as she slammed her teacup down, a jarring sound that broke the silence like a crack of thunder. Yes, we argued. Yes, I needed the money. Alice's words spilled out in a frantic rush, but her frantic attempt to explain fell apart mid-sentence, the unfinished words hanging in the air like a broken promise. Miss Marple watched her closely, her gaze unwavering, as Alice's eyes darted nervously from one face to another, seeking either defense or escape. Julian remained silent, his expression unreadable, while Colonel Whitaker's raised brow spoke volumes. A judgment so sharp it cut deeper than any words ever could. Behind them Mrs. Dracott stood motionless, a sentinel of indifference, offering no defense, no comfort, as though the truth had long ceased to matter. Alice, clearly on the edge, seemed desperate to absolve herself, but Miss Marple could sense something more than just guilt. It wasn't just the typical familial quarrel over money that had played out so dramatically. There was something more beneath the surface, a crack in the facade of innocence that Miss Marple had seen far too often in her years of observing human nature. The young woman's distress was genuine, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that desperation could be a powerful mask for deeper motivations. After the room had emptied and the house had fallen back into its uneasy quiet, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the rhythmic clicking of the needles at odds with the whirlwind of thoughts that churned in her mind. There was too much carelessness around Lady Frobisher's death, too many small things that didn't add up. The glass smeared with fingerprints, the empty pill vial, left in haste and disorder, spoke of someone who had either wanted to be caught or had made a grievous miscalculation. It wasn't just Alice's behavior that troubled her, it was the deliberate clues scattered around as if someone had expected the pieces to fall into place a little too easily. Then there was the missing envelope, conveniently absent, as though it had vanished into thin air, taking with it the most damning evidence. It wasn't panic that had guided Alice's actions, it was something far more calculated, far more seasoned. Miss Marple's instincts told her that the solution lay not in the immediate circumstances of the crime, but in a story that had started long before Lady Frobisher's death. Her suspicions were confirmed the next morning, when Miss Marple realized that Mrs. Dracott, always so present, so vigilant, had slipped away unnoticed. The housekeeper, once a fixture in every corner of the household, had retreated into the shadows, disappearing into the folds of her duties as if she had never existed. Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss such absences. They spoke volumes. Grief, she knew, did not make the loyal retreat. Only guilt could do that. Mrs. Dracott, it seemed, had found herself caught between the loyalty to her employer and the pull of self-preservation, and that, Miss Marple knew, was the most dangerous kind of guilt. Her curiosity piqued, she made her way to the parlor, her steps light but her resolve firm. The cabinet, so long undisturbed, beckoned her, standing silently in the corner, its contents a secret waiting to be uncovered. As Miss Marple approached, she felt the sharp edge of anticipation. Something told her that this quiet piece of furniture held more than just dust. It was a keeper of memories, of buried truths, and perhaps even a clue that would unlock the mystery. But before she could investigate further, she knew she had to gather more pieces of the puzzle. The village, as always, held its whispers, its secrets, and Miss Marple knew exactly where to listen. The name Edith echoed through the streets, a forgotten story that never truly ended. A young maid who had vanished, leaving behind only rumors and half-formed truths, whispers of a secret affair with the late Mr. Frobisher, followed by a quarrel that had left Edith tearfully pleading for something, no one knew what. And then, like smoke vanishing on a breeze, she was gone. A letter, hidden away, had sparked more speculation than answers. No one had ever seen it, but everyone had an opinion on what it contained. Miss Marple, with her careful attention to detail, pieced together the fragments of gossip. It was clear to her that Edith's disappearance wasn't an isolated incident. It was a part of something far larger, something far darker that had been carefully concealed over the years. The name that kept resurfacing, however, wasn't just Edith's. Miss Marple had begun to see it, Sully. There were murmurs, faint but persistent, that pointed to a connection between her and Edith, one that was far more tangled than anyone had realized. Something in the way the stories were told, the way they had been twisted over time, made Miss Marple wonder if Edith's disappearance had been part of a far greater scheme, one that might now be reaching its climax with Lady Frobisher's death. The pieces were falling into place, but Miss Marple knew better than to rush to conclusions. The truth, as always, was patient, hiding in plain sight, and only by following the subtle threads would she uncover the mystery that lay at the heart of Summerley. The village of Mary Mead had always been a place where memories lingered like the scent of forgotten flowers, each moment of the past etched into the cobblestones, never fully disappearing. It was a town that held on to its secrets tightly, especially when it came to stories that were never allowed to end. Miss Marple, as always, knew this all too well, which was why she had sought out the village's most trusted gossip sources, the greengrocer, the post office, and the local bakery. Her conversation had been light, casual, filled with polite questions, but her mind was sharper than the words she spoke, listening for any fragment of truth buried beneath the idle chatter. The name Edith, the vanished maid, still echoed in the village's collective memory, a name that people spoke of but never fully explained. Edith had been a beauty, a girl too pretty for her station, and her appearance had always been cause for whispers, particularly among the more curious townsfolk. There had been rumors of secret trysts with the late Mr. Frobisher, of hidden moments between the two that no one had witnessed but everyone had speculated upon. But Edith's disappearance, so sudden and complete, had raised far more questions than it had answered. On the day she vanished, there had been a quarrel, the kind that people always recalled but never fully understood. Lady Frobisher's sharp voice had cut through the air, and Edith's tearful reply had been interrupted by a slammed door. The house had gone eerily quiet after that, as if both women had been drawn into a silence they could not escape. But there had been something else, something more insidious. A letter, a note that Edith had received and hidden away. No one knew what it said, but the mere fact that it had been hidden, tucked away in secrecy, was enough to make Miss Marple believe that it held the key to everything. The more she pieced together from the scattered conversations, the more she realized Edith's story had never been just her own. It was a story that belonged to the house itself, a tale bound up in the very walls of the Frobisher estate. There were no simple answers here, no explanations that made sense. Miss Marple's suspicions grew darker as she turned her attention to the parlor cabinet, the one object Edith had treasured most in her brief time at the house. Miss Marple had learned that Edith's devotion to the cabinet had been almost obsessive, her fingers always tracing the carved edges, as if they held something precious, something she could never speak of aloud. When Edith disappeared, the cabinet remained behind, but only for a short time. Lady Frobisher, after Edith's sudden departure, had purchased it, a piece of furniture that seemed far more valuable than any heirloom. It was a purchase that had seemed too neat, too deliberate, to be merely a matter of replacing an item of household furniture. Lady Frobisher hadn't just bought a cabinet, she had claimed a piece of Edith's life, perhaps to hold on to her secrets, perhaps to ensure that no one else would ever uncover them. It was a small detail, but it nagged at Miss Marple. She could not shake the feeling that there was more to this cabinet than just its polished surface. Late one evening, with the house unusually quiet, and the darkness outside thickening, Miss Marple returned to the parlor. She moved slowly, her hand steady with purpose, and knelt beside the cabinet. Her touch was light, as if she were handling something fragile, and with practiced ease, she found the hidden compartment. Secrets, Miss Marple had learned, always found their place when left undisturbed for long enough. She opened the compartment, and there, pressed into the corner, almost lost to time, was a torn piece of paper. It was brittle with age, the edges fragile and worn. The handwriting, unmistakable in its hurried uneven scrawl, was Edith's. As Miss Marple read, her heart quickened. The words were sharp, trembling across the page. "Someone is watching me," Edith had written, the ink barely legible in some places, but the fear was unmistakable. The entry stopped abruptly, as though Edith had been interrupted in mid-sentence, or worse, as if she had been silenced before she could finish. The fear in those words was palpable, and the implications were chilling. Edith had not simply left in a fit of anger, or to escape a difficult life. No, someone had been watching her, someone had made sure she would never speak of what she knew. As Miss Marple carefully folded the fragile page, her mind raced. The cabinet, once just a piece of furniture, had become a keeper of forgotten truths, holding its secret for all these years, standing mute as the events of the world had unfolded around it. It had remained steadfast throughout the years, the second marriage of Lady Frobisher, the slow decline of Soulé, and now, the death of Lady Frobisher herself. The cabinet had been there, holding its secret, just as Edith had left it. Miss Marple knew that silence, though, is never truly silent. It seeps into the cracks, into the cautious glances of housekeepers, into the brittle temper of nieces, into the sudden reappearance of estranged sons. The cabinet had borne witness to it all, and now, Miss Marple would ensure it finally spoke. She sat in the parlor, the torn page resting in her lap, deep in thought. The pieces were beginning to come together in her mind with the precision of a master seamstress. Edith's disappearance, the cabinet's strange journey from maid to mistress, the missing envelope, Lady Frobisher's fearful glances, they were not separate, isolated events. They were a single thread, tightly knotted around a secret that had been buried for far too long. And that secret, Miss Marple was certain, was worth more than just a confession. It was the kind of truth that could unravel everything. The envelope, she thought, must hold something far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. If someone had gone to such extraordinary lengths to conceal it, it could only mean that the story contained within was too dangerous to ever be told. Tomorrow, Miss Marple decided, would bring more than just quiet conversation. It would be a day for carefully chosen questions and answers, questions that would lead to the unraveling of secrets that had been held for far too long. The telegram that arrived the next morning, delivered by a slightly out-of-breath boy, would set the final pieces in motion, pulling at the threads of truth that had long been hidden in the shadows. The envelope had appeared without warning, as if it had materialized from thin air. No one had seen it arrive, nor could anyone explain how it came to be in the lost property box at the village post office. Its presence was unsettling, as though it had been deliberately placed by an unseen hand, quietly waiting to be discovered. Miss Marple received the news of its appearance with her trademark calm, her expression unchanged, though her mind was already unraveling the mystery behind the bizarre arrival. She knew instinctively that objects didn't just vanish and reappear on their own, especially when they were steeped in secrecy. Someone had deliberately placed the envelope there, someone who wanted it found but never returned to its rightful owner. The envelope lay innocuously on the counter, its edges more worn than the day before, as if it had passed through more hands than anyone dared admit. Miss Marple's fingers touched it gently, with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime reading between the lines of forgotten truths. She knew this was no ordinary letter, it was the kind of thing that once touched would change everything. Inside, she found the unmistakable handwriting of Edith, trembling, hesitant, as though each word had been a laborious decision. The paper was thin, faded, but the message was clear. Edith's confession, too late to alter the past, too small to change the present. It spoke of something slow and insidious, a quiet poisoning at Summerley House, a death that had not come by the quick hand of violence, but by something far more sinister, a powder, added to a drink. The victim, Lady Frobisher's first husband, dead before the glass was even set down. Edith had been there, standing frozen in the doorway, unable to speak, paralyzed by the horror unfolding before her eyes. The letter offered no explanation for why it had happened, only the cold facts of what had transpired. The words, though trembling, were clear. There was fear, not only of the secret, but of its consequences. Edith had been caught in the web, unsure of whether to reveal the truth or hold on to her silence, and in the end, silence had been forced upon her. Miss Marple read the letter twice, her sharp mind absorbing every nuance. There was something unsettling about it, something that didn't fit. Confessions, she knew, didn't always arrive so neatly wrapped, especially not when they came too late to save or condemn anyone. The letter had been crafted with the precision of someone who understood how to manipulate perception, to lead someone toward a conclusion without them realizing they were being guided. What disturbed Miss Marple most wasn't the content itself, but the subtle implication buried beneath it, the suggestion that the hand of the poisoner was female, a presence so familiar that it would have raised no suspicion. The village had long memories, and when stirred, they could unearth the deepest secrets. Margaret, Alice's mother, had been Lady Frobisher's closest companion during those years, a constant figure at Summerley House. The connection was too perfect, too neat. Already, whispers had begun to spread like wildfire. Was Alice paying the price for her mother's sins? Was the legacy of poison and betrayal being passed from one generation to the next? Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She had always been suspicious of convenient explanations, and this was one that felt too contrived, too easy. The tragedy of Summerley House was not simply a tale of inheritance and wealth, it was something older, something that had festered between two women who once called each other friend. As Miss Marple prepared to return the letter to its envelope, something caught her eye, a subtle hesitation in the stroke of one letter, a faint wavering in the hand that had written it. Most would have missed it, but not Miss Marple. She had spent a lifetime studying the smallest details, the faintest betraying marks that others overlooked. The handwriting, though clearly meant to match Edith's, bore an unevenness that hadn't been present in the diary page she had found in the cabinet. It was a forgery, well executed, but a forgery nonetheless. Whoever had written this letter had known exactly what they wanted Miss Marple to believe, and they had carefully constructed a lie that fit the narrative already believed by many. It was not a confession, it was a performance, a carefully rehearsed act meant to steer her toward the wrong conclusion. Someone was pulling the strings, trying to guide her down the wrong path, hoping that she would follow their carefully laid trail of deceit. And Miss Marple knew that the game was far from over. This was only the beginning of a much larger puzzle, one with far more at stake than a simple confession. It was a game of shadows, and Miss Marple was only just beginning to see the outlines of the figures lurking within. Miss Marple moved gracefully through the quiet village streets, the weight of the recent discovery pressing heavily upon her. The letter, now safely tucked away in her bag, seemed too calculated in its arrival. The mysterious envelope had appeared at the post office, its origins shrouded in secrecy, its presence as unsettling as a shadow creeping through the cracks of time. It had come from Edith, and though the words on the fragile paper were written with trembling hands, they spoke of a chilling truth, the slow, deliberate poisoning of Lady Frobisher's first husband, a death witnessed from the doorway by Edith, too stunned to intervene. Miss Marple's sharp eyes noted the incongruity of the letter, the faint tremor in the handwriting, a telltale sign that all was not as it seemed. This was no confession, but a performance, a carefully orchestrated lie, designed to lead her down a path of false assumptions. The fear in Edith's words, the unease between the lines, only deepened Miss Marple's suspicion. Someone wanted her to believe a certain story, one carefully wrapped in deceit. Her thoughts raced as she considered the implications. This was not just a tale of poisoning and betrayal, but a much older debt, one passed down like a dark legacy, echoing through the generations. It was a tragedy shaped by secrets too dangerous to reveal. Yet someone had tried, perhaps desperately, to ensure the truth would be unearthed. Miss Marple, however, knew better than to take anything at face value. The quietest truths were often the most elusive, buried beneath layers of fear and half-truths. As she reached her cottage, the weight of her own silent investigation was palpable. She had been led here, step by careful step, but she knew the final reveal would be more complex than anyone could have anticipated. The truth was close, yes, but so too was the danger of following the wrong trail. The evening tea at Sue was meant to be a social gesture, a simple gathering to calm nerves, but Miss Marple, as ever, had other designs. The guests arrived one by one. Alice, whose polite facade barely masked her simmering irritation, Julian, ever the reluctant participant, and Mrs. Dracott, her forced composure betraying the tension beneath. As Miss Marple poured the tea, her words were light, but the conversation was far from casual. She mentioned the envelope, almost carelessly, and watched as the room stiffened. The silence that followed was heavy, each person too aware of what was being said without being spoken. Mrs. Dracott was the first to crack, her hand trembling as the spoon slipped from her grasp. Her collapse was sudden, almost theatrical, but Miss Marple saw through the facade. It wasn't grief or shock that caused her to faint. It was guilt, the crushing weight of a secret that could no longer be kept. As Mrs. Dracott came to, her eyes darted toward Miss Marple, searching for a hint of what had been uncovered. But it was Alice, ever defensive, who spoke next, her tirade swift and vehement, as if the accusation had already been made, and she was preparing her defense. Her words were harsh, but it was the underlying fear that intrigued Miss Marple. Why had Alice assumed guilt when none had been directed her way? The tension in the room was palpable, the lines of truth and lies blurring in the heat of their exchange. And Miss Marple, ever the observer, did nothing but offer another cup of tea, her calm demeanor, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in the room. There was something about Alice's reaction that struck Miss Marple as telling. Not her defense, but her instinct to defend herself against an accusation that had not yet been laid. Something was amiss, and Miss Marple knew the key to unraveling the truth lay hidden in the most subtle of gestures. The play had begun, but the curtain had not yet fallen. The room was thick with a silent anticipation, the kind that clung to the walls like a dark mist, impossible to ignore. Miss Marple sat poised in the dim light, her fingers absently curling around the edge of her teacup, as if she were contemplating the delicate balance between politeness and truth. The letter, once tucked away innocuously, folded neatly and hidden, had now worked its way into the air like a poison, infecting everything it touched. It had become the unspoken presence in the room, a haunting spectre that lingered in the corners of their conversations, never quite leaving. Alice, sitting on the edge of her chair, her posture stiff as if bracing herself against an unseen force, couldn't mask the panic flickering beneath her poised exterior. Her fingers twitched restlessly, her eyes darting from one face to the other, as if searching for some sign, some gesture that might indicate that she could still control this unraveling storm. But it was Julian, ever the reluctant participant in this game of accusations and deceit, whose reaction was most telling. His hand, once poised to bring the teacup to his lips, faltered, hovering mid-air, as if caught by an invisible thread. He turned away abruptly, his eyes briefly flicking toward the door, and without a word, he stood up, his movements sharp, as though desperate to flee. No one followed him with words, but the message was clear: he had been caught. His exit was not that of a man stepping toward a responsibility, but of someone running from a past that had finally come knocking. And Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, said nothing, simply watching his retreat with a knowing gaze. She understood now. Julian had not come back out of any lingering affection for Sue or duty to those who lived within it. No, he had returned because the weight of a history, one he had long hoped to forget, had finally caught up with him. The truth had demanded his presence, and he had come, not to face it, but to contain it. But Miss Marple knew, truths once disturbed, could never be contained. They slipped through the cracks, seeping into the air, into the very fabric of conversations, until there was nothing left to do but either confess or flee. And Julian, it seemed, had chosen the latter. His actions, his hurried departure, had told Miss Marple everything she needed to know about his involvement, his desperation, and the guilty knowledge that had been clawing at him for far too long. As the tea cooled, a quiet tension simmered, thick enough to choke the air, yet no one spoke. Miss Marple, with her unruffled demeanor, added a simple, almost casual remark: "The tea tastes different today. A bit bitter, don't you think?" Her words were soft, almost kind, but in the quiet that followed, they were like a crack of thunder in a still sky. No one answered, but the reactions were clear enough. Mrs. Dracott, her hands trembling slightly, reached for her cup, but faltered, the motion too forced, too strained. Alice clenched her jaw, her knuckles white against the table, her breath shallow, as if she too felt the weight of what was being implied. But it was the faintest hesitation from Julian, already halfway out the door, that told the story. His pause, lasting just a beat too long, spoke volumes. The truth was not spoken aloud, but it had already been understood. Poison, that bitter word, didn't need to be said. It was embedded in the walls of this house, a quiet legacy of death, that lingered in the spaces between polite conversations, in the whispered fates of those who had come before. Miss Marple knew it all too well. The past had left its mark, its fingerprints hidden in the cracks of the floorboards, in the threads of the curtains, and in the very air they breathed. She had seen it in the eyes of those who thought they had buried it long ago, but who now, one by one, were showing their true colors. The truth had surfaced, unwilling to stay buried any longer, and now the room thick with secrets had no choice but to acknowledge it. Miss Marple rose slowly from her seat, her movements deliberate, her fingers grazing the surface of the cabinet across the room. The wooden frame, solid and unyielding, had always seemed so ordinary, yet there was nothing ordinary about it. It was a vessel for memories, for histories long buried, and it had quietly observed the passage of time, storing secrets that none of them had been willing to confront. Miss Marple's fingers slid along the wood, feeling for the faintest hint of irregularity. There it was, an imperceptible shift, a soft click that no one else could have heard. She pressed her hand against the back panel, and with a slight groan, the wood gave way, revealing a narrow slit. Her breath caught for only a moment before she carefully pulled out a small crumpled piece of paper. It was brittle with age, the edges frayed, the ink smudged almost beyond recognition. But the words were clear enough, written in Edith's hand though shaky, as though fear had seized the pen and made every stroke a struggle. It was not a letter meant for the world to see, but a private confession, hidden away not just to protect the truth but to keep it buried, where only someone who truly understood the weight of what they were looking for could find it. Miss Marple smoothed the paper out gently, feeling the weight of Edith's fear, her desperation. The handwriting, though shaky, told a tale of someone who had known the truth was closing in, someone who had known their fate was sealed, but had hoped, foolishly, that hiding the truth might stave it off for just a little longer. It hadn't worked. The truth was already here, and now, as Miss Marple stood alone in the room, the weight of it was heavy in her chest. She knew the game had changed. No longer was it about discovering the past, it was about confronting it, about pulling the threads that had long been hidden and watching as they unraveled, one by one. And the question now was not just about the letter or the secrets buried within the walls, it was about the people in this room. The truth had caught up with them all, and soon they would be forced to face what they had done, or run, and only one would walk away. The room felt colder now, the shadows heavier, pressing in like a secret that had grown too large to stay hidden. Miss Marple sat at the heart of the stillness, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, each sound a deliberate puncture into the oppressive silence. The letter, now carefully unfolded, lay heavy in her lap, a confession wrapped in the desperate scribblings of Edith's final moments. The message itself was short, almost brutally so, but what it conveyed was anything but. Edith had seen it all, the death of Lady Frobisher's first husband, the carefully orchestrated glass of wine, the subtle tremor in the hand before it was passed to him, a death masked as an accident, but all too deliberate. And then, in a twist of cruel fate, Edith had become the next victim. Not struck down with brute force, but poisoned just as quietly, just as precisely, each grain of the deadly powder slipping into her evening tea, the dizziness creeping in like a thief in the night. She had known what was happening, of course, the nausea, the cold sweat, the knowledge sinking into her gut before it fully took hold. But by then, it was too late. Edith's final act, the one that would betray the horrors of Sir, was this note, a desperate trembling attempt to leave behind a shred of truth, to ensure the world knew, even if only for remembrance, that justice had not been served. Miss Marple folded the paper with reverence, her fingers brushing the fragile edges, as if she could somehow feel the weight of Edith's pain, her fear. Edith had died not for what she had done, but for what she had witnessed. Her life had been snuffed out because the walls of Sir were never thick enough to keep such secrets safe, and those walls had watched with quiet malice, as the truth festered, waiting for the day it would emerge from the shadows. The note's final line, scrawled hastily in a hand trembling from the effects of the poison, sent a chill down Miss Marple's spine. They buried me beneath the orchard. The words hung in the air like a curse. Edith hadn't disappeared as the village had whispered, hadn't eloped with a lover or run away in shame. No, she had been silenced and hidden beneath the very trees that Lady Frobisher's guests had admired for their beauty, the blossoms masking the crime buried in the roots below. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the cabinet across the room, its wood polished and worn, guarding its secrets like a sentinel. It was no wonder Lady Frobisher had kept it so close, no wonder Mrs. Dracot had tended to it with such fierce loyalty. It had held Edith's truth for years, buried deep within its wooden frame. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating, as if the house itself had become an accomplice to the silence that had pervaded for so long. Secrets, Miss Marple knew, were like seeds planted in the dark. They grow sometimes far beyond the reach of the one who hid them, until they can no longer be contained. And as she sat there, alone with the unraveling of that dark past, she realized that the time for running was over. It was not just a story now, it was the truth, and it was ready to be told. Mrs. Dracot stood rigid by the door, her hands clasped tightly, as though preparing herself for something inevitable. Alice sat frozen, her eyes wide, as if bracing for a storm. Julian, by the mantel, stared at the fire, his face hollow, betraying nothing but the guilt he had carried for too long. Miss Marple's voice broke the silence, soft but unyielding. "I believe it's time we spoke of what happened at Sir. both now and all those years ago," she said, her gaze moving from one face to another. No one spoke, not a single word, for the weight of her words hung heavily in the room. Each of them had been waiting for this moment, some with dread, some with hope, but none were ready for the truth. The house itself seemed to hold its breath, its walls trembling under the pressure of secrets that could no longer be concealed. Miss Morell's gaze settled on Mrs. Dracott, her hands now twisted in her lap, betraying the storm of emotions roiling beneath her composed exterior. "Loyalty," Miss Morell began, her voice cool but deliberate, "can be a powerful thing." All eyes turned to Mrs. Dracott, whose fingers dug deeper into the fabric of her apron. Loyalty had been her shield, the quiet force that had allowed her to guard the truth, to protect a family that had buried its darkest secrets. But loyalty, Miss Morell knew, was nothing more than a veil, one that could only cover the truth for so long before it tore away to expose what had been hidden beneath. And as the last threads of deception unraveled, Miss Morell could already hear the distant rumblings of the storm to come, the storm of reckoning that would change everything. Miss Marple's voice softened, yet each word cut through the tension like a knife. "Loyalty," she began, "is a fine thing, yes, but misplaced. It can transform into something far more dangerous, something lethal." She paused, allowing the weight of the truth to settle. It was as if the very walls of the room were holding their breath, waiting for the confession to unfold. "The first Mr. Frobisher," she continued, "was a man who wore charm as a mask, but behind closed doors, that mask cracked and revealed the cruelty beneath. His wife, Lady Frobisher, suffered in silence, and it was Mrs. Dracott, loyal to a fault, who witnessed it all. She saw the violence, the anger, the broken promises. It wasn't just loyalty that bound her to Lady Frobisher, it was something darker, something desperate. One fateful night, Mrs. Dracott, driven by a blind need to protect, took matters into her own hands. She slipped poison into his brandy, not for greed or inheritance, but for the safety of the woman she served. A grim silence followed. Mrs. Dracott's face was ashen, her hands trembling as she clutched the corners of her apron, as if holding on to the last vestiges of control. Miss Marple's gaze never wavered. It wasn't premeditated, but once the line was crossed there was no going back. The room held its breath, the air thick with unspoken guilt. "That," Miss Marple continued, her voice unwavering, "is where the story truly begins." She shifted her gaze to the young maid, Edith, whose innocent mistake would set the stage for everything to come. Edith had seen something she wasn't supposed to see. A glance, a hesitation, a glass passed from hand to hand. She hadn't known the weight of her discovery, but the careless word, the nervous glance, had been enough to seal her fate. And so Miss Marple murmured softly. Edith too became part of a deadly chain of events. The room seemed to shrink as the realization sank in. A dose carefully measured, slipped into her tea, not enough to kill outright, but enough to weaken her, to silence her, to ensure she would not speak. Mrs. Dracott's breath was shallow, each word from Miss Marple deepening her shame. "Edith never left, did she?" Miss Marple's words were not a question but a quiet, inevitable truth. Her body was hidden beneath the orchard, buried in secret, where no one would think to look. A quiet death, buried beneath the soil, hidden by time and the weight of silence. Mrs. Dracott's head fell into her hands, a broken whisper escaping her lips. "I only wanted to protect her." But Miss Marple was unyielding. "Protection, Mrs. Dracott, is not silence bought with death." There was a long pause as the weight of the words settled into the room, and then Miss Marple's gaze turned to the empty chair, where Lady Frobisher should have been. "Lady Frobisher knew," she said quietly. "She knew from the beginning. Not perhaps at first, but as the years passed, as the whispers grew louder, she knew why her husband had died. She knew why Edith had disappeared." A shadow seemed to pass across the room, and for a moment, it felt as if the very walls themselves held their breath. But fear kept her silent. Fear of scandal. Fear of losing her most loyal companion. Fear of the truth that could unravel everything. Miss Marple's eyes flickered briefly to Mrs. Dracott. And fear of her own complicity. It was then as if on cue that the letter appeared, an old relic from the past, a whisper from the grave that threatened to drag everything into the light. The room seemed to shudder, the very air growing heavier as Miss Marple continued. And when that letter was found, Mrs. Dracot acted once again, pushing Lady Frobisher down the stairs in a desperate bid to silence the only remaining witness. The room felt suffocating, the truth now hanging like a storm cloud ready to burst. Loyalty, Miss Marple concluded softly, is a force that can destroy as easily as it can save. But fear, when left to fester, is far more dangerous. It can turn the most gentle heart into something unrecognizable. The room remained still, the silence oppressive, as the full weight of the truth settled upon them all. No one moved, no one spoke. The truth had been laid bare, and with it the past had finally come to claim its due. The air, thick with the weight of truth finally spoken, seemed to hold its breath as Miss Marple's words lingered in the room. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, remained still, her voice now softer, as if the very telling of the tale had taken a toll on her as well. "It is always the smallest decisions," she began, her tone tinged with sorrow, "that led to the greatest tragedies. A loyal servant, devoted to her mistress, takes a step too far. A frightened maid, trembling with fear, utters a word she should have kept. And a mistress, gripped by terror, chooses silence, when in truth, a single word could have saved them all." The silence that followed her words was heavy, like a storm about to break. No one moved. The room held its breath, but Miss Marple, calm and composed, continued. "The house remembers," she said, her voice barely a whisper, as though she were speaking not just to those in the room, but to the very walls themselves. "The furniture remembers. Even the orchard remembers." Her eyes never left Mrs. Dracot, whose hands, trembling just moments before, now lay still, the weight of the confession settling into her bones. There was no satisfaction in Miss Marple's voice, no sense of triumph in solving the mystery, only a gentle, profound sorrow, one that came from the understanding that every action, every choice made in fear, had led to this very moment. Mrs. Dracot, once alone in her burden, now found solace in the shared truth. It was a moment of quiet release, as if the secret had been lifted from her shoulders. Miss Marple, with a graceful motion, reached for her knitting, her fingers resuming their familiar rhythm. It was as if the telling of the story had returned her to a place of calm, a place where the tangled webs of human emotion and hidden motives could be untangled, stitch by delicate stitch. "Secrets," Miss Marple said softly, "always find their way to the surface. And when they do, it is not the discovery that matters, it is the courage to face what has been hidden." The parlor clock struck, its chimes filling the air with a sense of finality. Outside, the orchard stood silent once more, the past now laid to rest. After all the lies, the betrayals, and the carefully buried secrets of Summerley House, one truth stood clear. It was not always hatred that drove people to commit unspeakable acts. Sometimes, it was love twisted into fear, loyalty stretched too far, and silence bought at a price too high to pay. Miss Marple, who had always known this simple fact, now offered it to those around her. "No crime happens in isolation," she said, her voice steady and sure. "Behind every poisoning, every cover-up, every sudden disappearance, lies a human heart, afraid, desperate, or too loyal to let go. And in the end, it was not just the guilty who paid the price. It was everyone who chose silence over truth." But then, a question lingered, hanging in the air like an unanswered riddle. "If you were in Mrs. Dracot's place," Miss Marple asked, her voice now laced with quiet challenge, "bound by loyalty, haunted by fear, would you have done the same? Would you protect the one you loved, even if it meant becoming a criminal yourself?" The question, so simple yet so profound, hung in the air, waiting for an answer. "What would you have done?" Miss Marple continued, her gaze turning toward the unseen audience. "If you uncovered a deadly secret in your own home, would you speak up, or would you bury it, hoping the past would stay quiet?" She paused, her eyes narrowing, with gentle curiosity, as if she could already hear the answers in the silent spaces between the words. "Share your thoughts in the comments below," she invited softly, "and let's unravel this moral mystery together." If you enjoyed this tale, and wish to hear more gripping mysteries, don't forget to subscribe. There's a world of dark secrets, brilliant deductions, and classic twists waiting for you here. And of course, share this story with your friends, fellow mystery lovers. After all, who doesn't love a puzzle that only Miss Marple could solve? The final words hung in the air, and the room, now quiet once more, held a secret that would never truly stay buried. It was patient, waiting, but always ready to rise again.